Hey guys, this is Dr. Hayes, and today I want to talk a little bit more in detail about some of the minorities that we're going to be discussing throughout the semester. When we met the first day, we talked a little bit about, just very briefly, the three main groups of minorities that our readings are going to be divided into, just very briefly. But I wanted to go into a little bit more detail about each group and some of the examples of things we're reading in that group, and also some of the considerations of things in that of people in that group based on about representation in children's lit specifically is what we're talking about, how they are seen on the page, as we say, and how they are represented in the industry. So before we get into reading specific texts for the class, I wanted to take this time to talk a little bit more about the actual groups themselves and what some of the things are. So you can be thinking of these things as we approach each of these lessons and these groups in class. You can be thinking of these ideas and come to class ready with some questions. So if you recall, we're talking about three different minority groups in our class, and we're talking about racial/ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and sort of these social minorities. It's cultural minorities. So one of the things I want to talk about today is terminology, talking about these things, and that's kind of a big conversation and consideration with these. So I wanted to kind of get that out of the way at the beginning, along with some other things. So the first group, racial/ethnic minorities. And yes, there is a difference there. I'm using both of those terms, and I understand that they don't mean the same thing, but we're grouping them together in the class for our purposes for what we're reading. So race, just as a review of things you hopefully have already learned. Race refers to your physical DNA, the traits you're born with. That's the race that you belong to. Your ethnicity is a broader group. It's a culture group that you belong to. And people within the same ethnicity share not just DNA a lot of the times, but language, the same language or accent, the same religion many times, the same foods and cuisines, the same holidays, the same sort of cultural traditions, the same dress, things that they wear. And so ethnicity transcends physicality. It's not just what's in your body, because someone who is physically a certain race may not really in practice belong to an ethnicity that's commonly belonged to by that race. Or someone who is not physically a certain race might have been sort of taken into and adopted into an ethnicity that they aren't sort of physically the majority with. So race and ethnicity they aren't interchangeable terms, but they do relate. They do go together. So, I do want to make sure we distinguish between those terms. And if those kinds of things come up when we're reading, we can talk about that. So some of the groups we're talking about in the first unit, race and ethnicity, is the first one is Black people. So I say Black people because we're probably talking about some literature from multiple places. So if you are Black in America, we officially call you African American, right? That's the formal term for Black people who are in America or born in America, African American. But I mean, guess what? If you're British and Black, you're not African American. The official term over there is Black British, capital B, Black British. Some people you might hear be called African British or something like that. That's not as common. It doesn't really flow as easily. But if someone is Black British, they are a British person of African descent. And there are Black people who are from other places all around the world, and there's terms for them too that I'm not as familiar with. And most of what we're going to be reading that is either American or British, just because of that's how the children's book industry has grown. That's how the majority of publishing. Our school and this class is taking place in America. We're talking about texts in English, so we're limited a little bit of geographically to where we are. But this is a group that question I just mentioned. The terminology comes up. Do we have to say African American every time? Can I say black if I'm talking about a black person? Does it sound weird if I say black because I'm not black? Can I say, is African American sound too stuffy if I say that? If I'm just talking about a character in a book, say, and then their African American friend comes over, and is it too stuffy? So these are things to be thinking about, the terms, the kinds of terminology that goes along with these ethnic groups, and how it's kind of fraught with uncertainty. And so we're going to be reading different examples of black authors and characters. We're also going to be looking at Hispanic / Latinx texts as well, and this is another one of those groups where the terminology is iffy. Hispanic is usually referencing a group, an ethnic group that is descended from actual Spanish people, like Spain, like Spanish. But then Latino or Latina, which is usually abbreviated with an X on the end to take the gender out, Latinx, to take the gender out of it. That is Spanish-speaking cultures that aren't necessarily descended from Spain, right? So you have a different, and both of them can exist in the same geographic region. So there's some sort of sensitivity needed there, and just trying to say, I'm not sure. I'm trying to learn. Are you Hispanic? Are you Latino? Like, what's the difference? And just kind of being open-minded. But that's something that in America we specifically sort of deal with. We have a direct geographic connection to Hispanic and Latinx cultures because of geographically our border. We share a border with Central and South America. We have generations of sort of political strife between our two cultures, and so we have a lot of people in our country who are Hispanic or Latinx, and so it's sort of on our front of our minds here in the United States. If you're in Great Britain, that is not even a consideration. There are not nearly as many Hispanic people there. And so that is not sort of a dominant culture that they are trying to incorporate into their primary culture like we are here. So if you go to London, for example, the sort of, I would say the dominant minority culture there, just from my experience of being there and just from what I know, is Indian, people from India, because for geographic reasons. So India, for a long, long time, until not that long ago, was a colony of Great Britain. It was a British colony. There was a railroad, the Orient Express, that went direct line back and forth between England and India. And so there was a lot of influx of Indian people and the culture into Great Britain, specifically the populated areas like London. And so there, if you go to London, there are Indian cuisine, Indian restaurants on almost every corner, just like in the United States. Most towns have several Mexican restaurants, just because of the geographic proximity. So that's something when we get to those culture groups we can talk about as well. But that sort of the issue, the plight, if you will, of the Hispanic culture of being sort of subsumed into a more dominant culture just because of proximity and borders. So we can talk about that. Another group we're going to look at is Asian, and I wanted to mention, when you talk about Asian literature and Asian authors, the danger there is being a little bit reductive, right? It's just saying Asian. I do it, and I've done it in the syllabus and in our class because for expediency purposes, to try to streamline what we're talking about. But Asian Asia, the area, the region refers to, yes, it has what you might initially think of when you think Asian, China and Japan, maybe North and South Korea, places like that. But Asia also includes India, which is a completely distinct and diverse culture in and of itself. Asia also includes Russia, which is not what people think of when they say, when you hear somebody call someone Asian. You don't think, oh, they're probably Russian, right? So there's a little bit of disconnect there. When with it's a reductiveness when you just say Asian, you're taking one umbrella and incorporating a whole region of distinct cultures and groups. So that's something I want you to be thinking about when we get to the Asian texts that we're reading. And in America, when people say Asian American, usually the person is an immigrant from either China or Japan or maybe Taiwan or Korea or somewhere like that. We don't usually refer to Asian Americans, people from India, for example, we don't usually call them Asian American, or that's not who we think of. So these are just, again, terminology things to think of when we get there. Another group is Middle Eastern. That is an ethnic group, which we normally in our class, we're going to be talking about them in the religion unit, because typically when you think about someone from the Middle East, especially a character in a book, especially one that's a little bit more simplified for children, if you're going to have a character from the Middle East in a text or in a book of some kind, they're probably going to be Muslim. That's usually where we see people of Middle Eastern descent is a Muslim character, and so I wanted to just make sure we know, and we wrote, this is obvious, but yes, there are Middle Eastern people who are not Muslim, right? Who do not belong to that religious minority. Plenty of people. But, I'm thinking, and I don't really necessarily remember seeing, I can't think of any off the top of my head, of characters, especially in books for younger readers, who are depicted as simply Middle Eastern racial descent, ethnic descent, but not Muslim as they're practicing religion. Usually the two go together in literature, and that's an interesting thing to consider and talk about. So that's one of the things we can think of too. A couple other groups I wanted to mention in the racial group is indigenous peoples. That's one of them. So indigenous peoples are native peoples. So in the United States we have Native Americans, who white people call them Native Americans, but themselves, like their national organizations and what they call themselves American Indians. But I think white people feel weird calling them American Indians, because we've been trained that Indian is a misnomer. They're not actually Indians, they are Native Americans. So we sort of overcompensate on trying to be sensitive, and we say Native American for everything. But they themselves, in their government and their coalition and on the res, they call them American Indians. So I want to talk about that discrepancy when we get there too. So consideration with indigenous peoples, and not just Native American. Another group is like extreme North American groups like the Inuits. I think I don't know if it's derogatory, but the term that's not really accurate is Eskimos. You hear people say Eskimo, but it's the indigenous Inuit peoples of extreme North America. So something to consider with those groups is that their representation is usually romanticized. Like they are represented as this sort of like a thing of the past, like this group that used to wander the plains and hunt the buffalo and live in teepees, and they were peaceful and they were one with the earth, and they had all these sort of mystical beliefs and things like that. And so it's this sort of dreamy past tense existence that we think of indigenous peoples as having, but it's still a current thriving today present tense people group that live on various reservations throughout the United States, but you don't really see present day depictions very often. That's why I've chosen, we're going to read The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, because it's kind of one of the main ones. You think of also another example would be Twilight. Twilight, the werewolves in Twilight live on an Indian reservation, and they are sort of a modern day depiction of an American Indian tribe. So we're not reading that. I'm not having you read Twilight, but that's an example. One last group to talk about in the racial slash ethnic group that we're not really reading any of is groups, ethnicities of European or specifically Western European descent. Physically, like AKA white, like they are classified as white. If you fill out a government document, if you're one of these groups, you put white because there's not really anything else to put. But there are diverse groups within white. I'm talking about Irish and Scottish and Australian and even Italian, French, right? So if you're from any of those Western European descent, you're legally and you're racially you're described as white, but ethnically obviously there are differences between the Celtic people groups, Welsh and Irish and Scottish, and the Western European groups of French and Italian and things like that, Belgian, Scandinavian groups like the like Norwegian and Swiss and things like that. Those people, Icelandic, they're all pretty much white, like on a thing, and racially they're white, but ethnically there's a big diverse group. So we don't really, in this class, we're not really reading a lot of, or any. I'm trying to think. You have children's books that have like Viking characters, and with the popularity of Thor, with the Norse gods, that has come into more forefront. And we have, excuse me, Disney had Brave with Merida, the princess who's from Scotland, and it really accentuated the Scottish culture, and she had an accent, and the men were wearing kilts, and there was the requisite joke of, how men don't wear anything under their kilts. I don't think I've seen anything, any sort of entertainment representation of a character wearing a kilt where they didn't show that he was, there's always some joke about him being bottomless under the kilt. There's always, and I don't know if that's I think people in Scotland don't really appreciate that. As like that's the one thing that people know about with kilts, because it's like this ancient tradition of their ethnic dress, and then all that people want to know is, are you naked under there? So I don't know, I don't know, like that. Even the kids' movie Brave has a joke about that in it. So yeah, you see some of those groups come up in children's books and young adult books sometimes, but not really in a meaningful way that sort of explores their culture. It's more like figure characters like Thor, or like a Viking character, or sort of a person in a kilt or something like that, like a bagpipe player or something. Okay, but I want to move on to the religious minorities that we're talking about this semester as well. So sort of there's a couple big ones, and then there's some a little bit more less familiar ones that we're going to look at. So the main one we're looking at is, the first one is Jewish. So we're reading a few texts, and I've got some picture books and things of Jewish characters and Jewish literature for children. The big famous one is Anne Frank. That's what everybody knows about, is Anne Frank. And that kind of accentuates a stereotype with Jewish children's literature, which is, you basically, if you're going to read something, excuse me, I keep coughing. Can't clear my throat. If you're going to read something about Judaism, especially in a text intended for younger readers, it's going to be one of two things. It's going to be a book about the Holocaust, World War II, maybe in general. It might be a World War II book, and it talks about the Holocaust, or it'll be a character like Anne Frank or something about the Holocaust. You have Holocaust books. And then if not, you have the other kind of Jewish children's books you have are Hanukkah books, right? So you have books about Hanukkah, and you have books about the Holocaust. there's obviously a much more nuanced experience that you could have in the Jewish culture, but it's usually simplified into those groups, especially if you're going to have a Jewish character in a text that's not specifically about Judaism. You're going to have that character, and the only way that their Jewishness is accentuated or even exposed at all in the narrative is usually you have like a scene taking place at Christmas time, and then you have one character like who's sort of has to get the mention in there. Well, I'm doing Hanukkah instead. I'm not doing Christmas. And so you have a character who's celebrating Hanukkah instead of Christmas in some holiday scene in a show or in a picture book or, you know, a teen novel or something like that. So that's really kind of how it's represented in the literature, which, you know, is kind of a shame. Something that goes along with Judaism is a lesser known, I put this as a religious minority, but it might be more of a cultural, ethnic minority now that I'm thinking about it. I put it in the group for religious minorities because it goes along with Judaism really well. But I'm talking about the group, the Romani, which you're going to read an article about the Romani when we get there later in the semester. And so the Romani the Romani is a nomadic people group that doesn't really have a home country, but is a nomadic group. And the Romani were victims of the Holocaust alongside of the Jewish people. So we're looking at them together. The Romani, you will have heard them being described as gypsies. That's a derogatory term that's considered offensive by them. You would have heard them, you know, called as referred to as gypsies, and that is not an appropriate term. They one person from that group is a Roma. That's what their official title is, and then the plural for the whole group is Romani, the Romani people. So it's kind of like saying a Jew and then Jewish people, you know. So it's kind of, there's a singular plural. The Romani, sort of have the sort of history of being persecuted and having sort of being driven out and being sort of a refugee culture, and have sort of gotten this reputation, negative reputation, as sort of, you see like the fortune tellers and the, you know, a lot of times you see them depicted as being in like carnivals and circuses and things like that. And so that's the Romani is where we even get the derogatory term gyp. Like if you say, oh, I was gypped, you know, if you get less than what you think you deserved, or if you were expecting one thing and you got something worse or less, you say you've been gypped. Well, that comes from the term gypsy, with the negative sort of connotation of the Romani people who had this stereotype. People had a stereotype of them that they would try to trick you out of your money or trick you and then leave town, you know, and they were kind of sleazy in that way. So saying gypped is also considered to be sort of a racial slur to say gyp. Just FYI, the more you know. There you go. I just tickle myself. Okay, so another main group that we're looking at is Muslim. And so, as I mentioned, Islam is the dominant religion in the Middle East, but it's all over the world as well. There are Muslim people all over the world, many in the United States, and so, you know, so we're reading. You know, you have Muslim American type. That's a whole sort of culture in and of itself, beyond Middle Eastern Muslim, the Middle Eastern Muslim experience. So we're going to read some texts, you know, that feature Muslim characters. But one of the things I wanted to put in your brain about this to be thinking about, when you're talking about representation of Muslim characters on the page, the easiest way, sort of the easiest way to include a character and show that it's a Muslim character, especially if you're talking about a visual text, like a picture book or some book with illustrations or something. The easiest way, even a throwaway descriptor in a novel, is to have them be female. usually the Muslim characters that you see in novels are or picture books or anything are female. And the reason for that is because they wrap, they cover their head, they wear a hijab or maybe a full burqa or whatever, and whatever they may, their sect has them wear. But you can have a picture in a picture book of a classroom or a crowd or people at the zoo, and you can put a hijab on one or two of the characters or even just one, like boom, there we go, Muslim, see, check, diversity checklist, we've got a Muslim, right? So it's a real easy sort of visual marker that there's a Muslim character, is if you have them be female and they're wearing a cover, their heads wrapped. And so because of that, less frequently you see characters that are obviously male Muslims. Usually if someone's going to be depicted as a male Muslim, it's much more negative. Like they're depicted as more like a terrorist or a threatening figure. Otherwise, they would just be sort of a nondescript brown. If you were trying to draw someone like, oh, okay, so they're clearly, maybe I could maybe even pinpoint this character in this crowd in this illustration as, I could tell they're Middle Eastern. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're Muslim, right? So a lot of times it's a diversity shortcut to have a woman who is a Muslim and you put a wrap on her, and it's much more clear without having to delve into that character more deeply to show us why they're Muslim. So one thing when we get to Islam, I do want to talk about, because I don't think I'm going to have you read anything from it. I don't know, I haven't decided yet. I might, but there is John Green's An Abundance of Catherines. I think I don't know, we might read a little bit from Abundance of Catherines, but the two main characters in Abundance of Catherines are teenage boys who are best friends. One of them is Jewish and one of them is Muslim. And so there's some really interesting dynamic between the two. And it's a male Muslim character who is depicted in a positive light. So I definitely want to talk about it when we get there. A couple other groups that we're looking at in the religious minorities is Eastern religions. So we're doing at least a lesson about Eastern religions. I'm specifically focusing on Buddhism, which is much more prominent in China and some of the, not all of it, but the Chinese region, and Hindu, which is primarily religion from India. So there are children's books about Buddhism and Hinduism that depict Buddhist characters, figures, the Buddha himself, and just there are some Buddhist children's books that just sort of feature some of the ideals of Buddhism, like mindfulness and meditation. If there's books about meditation that aren't overtly sort of proselytizing or teaching about Buddhism specifically, but they do talk, they have characters who meditate, or they have instructions about meditating and mindfulness, and those are some Buddhist principles that are sometimes disconnected from the religion itself. And there are Hindu children's books as well that have tales from, there are tales of short stories from India, and there are tales like children's books that feature Hindu gods and goddesses and tell their story and depict them as sort of these mythical creatures, just like Odin or Zeus or somebody like that. There are Hindu gods in children's books as well. So I've got a couple of those for you to read. They're not as common, but they do exist. Another group we're going to look at is pagan. Pagan children's books are pretty rare. I didn't own any, and I had a hard time finding even a few. So I found a few that I'm going to have us look at, picture books, and so sometimes you might hear a mention of like the solstice or something like that, and especially around the holidays. There's the winter solstice, or those kinds of celebrations, but it's not super in depth. But every now and then there are some children's books that are very they represent paganism, or even maybe Wiccan characters a little bit. You might see Wiccan characters in books for older readers, like teenagers and stuff. There might be a legitimate depiction of a Wiccan character or group, but I don't think I've ever seen like a young children's book about the Wiccan religion, or that had witches in it that weren't cartoonish, or this sort of magical, like witch, right? You don't really have a more honest portrayal or even positive portrayal of a person who practices the Wiccan religion in books for little kids. So we'll talk about that too. I also found some books about voodoo, which kind of goes in with the last group I want to talk about, which is this sort of mystical religions. The ones we're going to look at are voodooism, which is the French Cajun religion in New Orleans and the Bayou areas down there. But that's not the only people. There's people in Africa, groups in Africa that practice voodoo as well. And it's a real religion, but it's a lot of times cartoonized or villainized as sort of just bad magic, voodoo or whatever. So we're going to talk about that when we get there as well. But there's other mystical religions as well. Like a lot of times that's something that goes along with talking about American Indians, is this sort of mystical beliefs. So the issue you get to with that group is classification and genre. So anything that has like talking to ghosts, or a tree that is alive and has a spirit and can talk, or anything like nymphs and animals that can talk, and animals that are sort of anthropomorphized and have personalities. Those are all typically categorized by the mainstream culture as fantasy books. Those are fantasy novels. However, there are people groups and ethnic groups, religious groups, that believe in much more mystical. They have more mystical beliefs, like for example, the Native American tribes have these belief in like animal spirits and ancestral spirits and nature spirits, and with the Celtic people groups you have sort of these nature spirits and things. Even a little bit some in South American, some of the South American people groups have some beliefs and some mystical occurrences and things. So if you're talking about a text from a minority voice and about minority characters, some elements included in the narrative would be classified as fantasy in mainstream culture, but are not considered fantasy. That would be insulting to call those beliefs fantasy for that people group. So again, when we get there, we can talk about that. The last group that we're going to talk about in the class is the sort of social / cultural minorities that have nothing to do with your ethnicity really, or your race, your religion, anything like that. It is sort of it's a social group that you've been thrust into, and so your life experience is out of the mainstream. That's you are in a minority in your life experience. So we're talking about LGBTQ. That's one of the main ones. So LGBTQ characters, LGBTQ authors, experiences. Some of I have a whole. We'll go through a whole thing of this when we get there. But until I would say until recently, LGBTQ themes and characters were sort of reserved for older readers, YA books, teens, high school aged kids, things like that. If you're going to have quote unquote children's books that featured LGBTQ themes and characters, they were going to be for teens. That is changing. There are several picture books now. We're going to read one or two of them, so we'll look at that like visual representations of the LGBTQ experience for younger readers. You have books that have children who have two moms or two dads. You have books about transitioning. Even you have books that have children characters who are trans, and sort of kind of how they're dealing with that. And it's depicted in a very sort of graceful, understanding way. And so some of those you think, okay, is this is again one of those questions: who's it for? Is it to teach sort of cisgendered or people who are the gender they were born with? Is it to teach children like that about, sort of to help them kind of understand the trans mindset, or is it about trans children to help see themselves on the page? So that's, there's a lot of interesting things, and this is pretty new. You were talking about the last maybe couple of decades, or at the most, where we've had LGBTQ characters and themes in books for little kids. And so since that's such a new thing we're exploring in our culture, I wanted to definitely talk about that. And we'll definitely talk about the love stories of LGBTQ characters and in the teen lit genre, which is has sort of a longer, a little bit more established history. Another social minority is people like immigrants and refugees who are misplaced from their home. This kind of goes along with ethnic minorities, and the experiences of ethnic minorities, but I do think it's a little bit of a unique experience, because not everybody in that ethnicity is a refugee. Not everybody in that ethnic group is an immigrant. So being an immigrant, even if you're an Irish immigrant or a Chinese immigrant or something like that, being an immigrant to a country kind of puts you in a group with the other immigrants, and that you can sort of commiserate and you can identify with that experience, even if you're not in the same ethnicity. And it gives you a completely different experience than other members of your ethnicity who did not immigrate, right? So that is an interesting complication of that experience. Another one is characters who are homeless or orphans, which kind of seems like the same thing, but homeless is usually applied more to older children, like teenagers, people who are kind of on the street, right, on their own. So homeless. And then orphans, some of them are homeless, but a lot of orphans in literature live in an orphanage, right, or foster care, or they have a place to live. They're not homeless, they're just orphans. Or they're in school or something. Like Harry Potter is like the classic example. He's an orphan, but he's not homeless. Do you see? You wouldn't even, I don't know if you would even call him, you would consider him in the adoption, because that's the other group, adopted kids. So you have children or characters who were adopted, and they're not homeless, and they maybe don't even consider themselves orphans, because they have parents who they've known since they were babies, and so their experience of being adopted is completely different from someone like, say, Anne of Green Gables, who's adopted as a middle school child, a 12-year-old or something. So those aren't all, they don't all exactly, they're not synonymous. So I did separate them out. Homelessness, orphans, being adopted, like that puts you in a sort of social minority. And there are issues and terminology that go along with all of those in an experience. So we're going to read some excerpts of books about famous orphans and books about adoption and things when we get there. Another group, the last group we'll talk about, is children with disabilities, both physical and mental. So physical disabilities, like you might have a character in a wheelchair, or a character with a leg brace or crutch, or a character with a like we're going to read excerpts from Wonder, so the character has facial deformities. You might have a character who's missing a limb, missing an arm or a leg, or something like that. And so you have characters with physical disabilities. Those also include physically observable conditions like, say, Down syndrome, or muscular dystrophy, or trying to think of being vision impaired or hearing impaired or a mute, things like that. There's books with characters who have all kinds of physical disabilities, and the issues that go along with that. Again, it's the terminology. What do we call them? They don't. It's considered derogatory to say a disabled person, because you put their condition first and their personhood second. So instead of disabled people, they prefer people with disabilities. They're people first, and then they have a disability, right? People with disabilities. So just those little switch of terms is what makes all the difference with some sensitivity and inclusion. There's also non-observable disabilities like mental illness. Again, this is much more prevalent in older reader texts, like young adult books. Again, I have to cite John Green. His most recent novel, Turtles All the Way Down, features a protagonist who has mental illness, and is very open about her struggle with her mental illness. But there are other examples of characters who get panic attacks, or who have they are maybe even manic depressive, maybe schizophrenic, multiple personalities. Like, you have depictions of mental illness in texts for young people, but most of the time, I can't really think of very many examples. They are for teens. Now, the one caveat, the exception, I would say, is characters with autism. You do have characters with autism in books for young people. Like, there are books about being autistic, and those are usually for typically brained children to read, to learn more about autism and their maybe classmates or siblings who are autistic. And you have characters who just happen to be, like Sesame Street had an autistic character that they introduced, a puppet, who one of the puppet characters who had autism has autism present tense. I think she's still on there. 2 or 3 years ago they introduced that. That was a big milestone. So if you're going to have a sort of mental disability represented on the page for children, it's usually going to be autism. But for older people, you have a little bit more of a diverse representation of mental illness. So as usual, just to kind of sum up, those are the groups we're going to be looking at, and some of the considerations to think of is who's creating these depictions, who's writing these books, who's painting these pictures. Is it someone from that minority group, or is it someone from outside of that minority group, and does that matter? Those are things to think about. What is on the page? Like, what's being depicted on the page? Is it favorable? Is it accurate? Is it sort of in the background, or is it in the forefront? Are the minority characters just sort of people in the friend group and not the protagonist? That's usually the case. So that's something to think about. Who are the texts for? Is it for people in that minority group to basically to see themselves and to have representation, or is it intended for people in the mainstream culture or in other people groups, not the depicted people group? Is it for an outside reader to learn about the culture or the ethnicity or people, religion, whatever it might be? Those are things to think about. Do the characters have an accent? It's really hard in text. You see that more in, like, visual mediums like movies and things, which we're not necessarily talking about fully, but we can. But you might have characters, especially in older books, where if they have an accent, it's written out phonetically to where their accent is part of their character. And is that accurately depicted, or are they being made fun of with their accent? Like, when we get to American Born Chinese, we will see a Chinese character who drops his R's and says America, and and it's spelled out like that. And it's cringy. It's like, it's off-putting. So we'll talk about that too, like if accents are represented. Again, what genre are these put into? Based on, is it fantasy because it has spirit animals in it? But that would be insulting to call it fantasy if you are in that religious group that believes in that thing. Also, is the terminology or the the classification system being used, is it reductive or disrespectful? Like when we say Asian, but we really mean Chinese or we really mean Japanese, but we don't know which one. We might see a character and they look like they could be Chinese, but we don't know for sure. So we say Asian, right? And we think, oh, that covers it. Well, Asian, like we covered, covers a lot of different countries that racially and physically don't resemble anyone from China. So that's just, are we using reductive terminology? That's another thing to think about. So I think that's enough for this video. It's about 45 minutes, which is probably about how long we would talk about this in class, if I was talking in class. So now I think you have a good foundation going forward. We're ready to get into actually reading some of the texts from these authors. And so these are some things for you to think about each unit when we get to these groups. I wanted to kind of get it out of the way so that you'd have plenty of time to think about it, and then before you read, you have something in your mind to look for each of these texts and groups of texts that we're reading when we get to that people group. So I hope that you guys are having a good week so far, and I hope everything's going great. And if you have any questions, obviously let me know. But otherwise, have a good rest of your day, and I will see you later.